All right, so today we're looking at the passage from the Sermon on the Mount around an eye for an eye. And so we've been studying out the Sermon on the Mount as a part of our series of living the life of a Christian patriot. And so turn with me to Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to look at verses 38 through 42. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." So yesterday was Halloween, as we all know, and the TV lineup was filled with bleak, scary, bone-chilling content. We talked about some of the things people watch before church today. But you know, the scariest things on TV yesterday were not the scary movies. For me, they're actually the political ads that we get bombarded with constantly. That might be the best part of the election, is that the political ads are over. But there's one in particular that seems to always be on the TV every time I turn it on. And it's particularly over the top as well. Picture this, if you will. There's a white woman driving a minivan, and she's pulling up to her home. And there's an ominous figure dressed all in black, hunched over in front of her front door, trying to jimmy the lock and get in. He scurries away as she pulls up, and she's talking about how these days she's so scared to go to the grocery store because politicians are letting all the criminals out of jail. I'm not sure that's accurate as to what's happening, and it's clearly over the top, but it's clearly referencing things that are happening within our legal system today. There's a lot of momentum around criminal justice reform, right? And this is in particular addressing something called cash bail, right? And there's different thoughts on whether or not cash bail should be a part of our criminal justice system. And so there was legislation that was passed this year in New York State that aimed to create a more equitable system of justice for the poor. So you may or may not know this, but actually 2/3 of people incarcerated in local jails have not been convicted of a crime. They're detained on what's called pre-trial detention. And so they haven't been convicted, they're not guilty, but they won't be released because they can't pay for the bail. And so prosecutors and police advocates, they like this law. They like pretrial detention because it makes it more likely that someone will plead guilty to the crime that they're charged with. In fact, within our system, 90% of defendants plead guilty instead of going to trial. 90%. I know we watch a lot of Law and Order, and it seems like there's all these trials going on, and there are a lot of trials, but a lot more people are actually just pleading guilty. And many of those people actually have never seen any of the evidence that the police have to convict them. And it's legal for police to lie to them about what evidence that they have. Others plead guilty because they have jobs and they can't afford to be in jail and not work, and there's bills to pay. And so there's obviously flaws within the system, regardless of which side of the issue that you're on. You know, the US is home to 5% of the world's population, but our prison population makes up 25% of the world's prison population. There's a disparity there. The US incarcerates 3.5 times more than the European countries do as a rate of incarceration. And then we also have issues of racial disparity. We incarcerate African-American people at a rate of 8-to-1 compared to white people, and Hispanic people at a rate of 3-to-1 compared to white people. Nearly 7 million people in the US are either incarcerated or on parole or probation. And 77 million people in the US have a criminal record, which accounts for about 20% of our population. Blows my mind. 20% of our population has a criminal record. If we lined up buses bumper to bumper from New York City to San Francisco and filled them entirely with people, we would be able to fill them with the 10.6 million people that are admitted to jail each year. That's a crazy visual to think about. You know, there's a series of get tough policies that have become politically popular over the last 60 years. The key players in the country's legal system are elected positions in various levels of government, including local sheriffs, prosecutors, parole boards, executive clemency and pardoning authority, legislators voting on laws, and it makes the US criminal justice system more politicized and more responsive to popular opinion than it really should be. And so brings us back to the Sermon on the Mount. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses criminal justice reform. God has given the Jews a system of punishment commiserate with the crime. The punishment was handed out by judges God placed in positions of authority. In Exodus 21, verse 22, it says, if people are fighting and hitting a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there's serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. And Leviticus 24, verse 17 says, anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. You are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God. And finally, in Deuteronomy 19, verse 16, says, if a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse someone of a crime, the two people involved in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priests and the judges who were in office at the time. The judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then due to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge the evil from among us. The rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. Show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So the system was designed to separate God's people from sin, and punishment was determined by godly men. But as God's people drifted from him, the system also drifted. And at the time Jesus is speaking here in the Sermon on the Mount, the judges were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. See, the Sadducees were the law and order candidates of their day, handing out the harshest of interpretations. They often let the complainant hand out the punishment in an act of revenge, which is completely contrary to what the scriptures teach. The Pharisees were punitive as well, but they had shifted to a system of fines and fees where defendants could pay money in place of their punishment. Their system obviously favored the wealthy. And so we find Jesus speaking to the Jews, challenging the notion of vengeance and justice. Keep in mind that Jesus is challenging the listeners' hearts in the Sermon on the Mount. He's not saying that this is the only way to react to these situations, just as he's not saying someone can only pray alone or that we should all be blind amputees because we're sinful. So that brings us back to our passage in Matthew chapter 5. Verse 38, you've heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So within the passage, Jesus lays out 4 practical cases of injustice someone may face and calls for reactions very different than seeking an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. The first one we're going to look at is positive injustices. So these are things that you 100% did not deserve to happen to you. Positive injustices. This is verse 39. It says, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." Now, this is a hard teaching, if there ever was one, right? We do not, but we do get to see Jesus live it out when he was put on trial as an innocent man. You know, ever since sin entered the world, people have been wronged. We face injustices every day. On rare occasions, they're the physical nature, such as a slap on the cheek. We did see recently that can even happen to beloved Rick Moranis of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids fame, who was assaulted and accosted on the street in New York City. It could happen to any of us at any moment. But most of the time, it takes the form of a slight or a disrespect. And sometimes it comes from a stranger. This has probably happened to you before. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Someone takes your turn in the line at Delta Sonic because for some reason they have 3 lanes that turn into 2. Someone makes you wear a mask at Walmart, or zooms into a parking space where you were clearly waiting with your blinker on. You know, it was probably the perfect parking space. It was close to the door. The cars around it were neatly within the lines so that you wouldn't have to worry about your doors being dinged. What kind of animal pulls into your parking space when you clearly have your blinker on and have been waiting your turn? Our heart screams, eye for an eye. That person owes us a parking space. Not just any parking space, a perfect one of like value. They also owe me the time I waited for the space with my blinker on and the time it took me to hunt for another space. Additionally, they owe me the steps I took that were farther than I would have had to take from that parking space. What about the loss of respect I can see in the eyes of my kids as they shake their heads with judgment at me from the back seat? What a punk they must think I am. They owe me a chance to prove my masculinity to my wife after giving up on the space so easily. They should let me punch them square in the face, slash their tires, do something. Fantasies of vengeance like this play out in our minds all the time as we're ever vigilant of all the ways we're constantly treated unfairly. They wash over us like the delicious glaze of a Krispy Kreme donut. This is America. I'm promised the unalienable rights of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Yeah, that's what that means. I'm a bootstrapper, a self-made man. Don't you understand that self-centeredness is a virtue? I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees, all over a parking space, or a turn in line, or maybe even a slap in the face. But Jesus calls our hearts in a different direction. Rather than figure out restitution for the slap, turn the other cheek. Again, there's obviously hyperbole throughout the Sermon on the Mount, and there may be moments that were justified in self-defense. But what is our heart towards the person who wrongs us? Is it all about me? Have I been waiting for conflict to prove I'm not a punk? What impact does that have on God's kingdom? Romans chapter 12, verse 19 through 21 says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Overcome evil with good, not overcome evil with justified evil. What if instead of shaking our fist at the driver of the other car, we held the door for him on the way out of the store? We struck up a conversation. We realized that our kids go to the same school. We invited them for some socially distanced fun. How hard is it to see those who do us wrong as lambs being led to slaughter rather than wolves in the henhouse? But how much more impact would we be in a broken world if we did? Turn the other cheek requires a turn away from self and a turn towards God. But sometimes the slap is not from a stranger at all. It's from a loved one. They refuse to do their share of the chores. They spend money that I didn't authorize. They say hurtful things that get you upset every time. The same standard applies. Turn the other cheek. How much stronger would our relationships and our marriages be if we were quick to overlook an offense rather than always looking at ourselves as the person wronged? Now, the second case that Jesus refers to is called possible injustice. These are things that look like you're wronged from your perspective, but you may not have all the facts. Verse 40 says, "And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well." The cloak or the coat was the outer garment and likely the most expensive clothing that someone owned. They also didn't have a closet full of clothes like we do now. In this scenario, the person is being taken to court over a small matter. And Jesus says, don't just give them what they ask for, give them something far beyond that. This is a challenging teaching as well, right? You didn't want to give them anything. Don't just give them what they asked for, give them more than that. We've all likely heard the phrase, I give you the shirt off my back. Well, how often have we put it into practice? Here we are giving all our clothing to this person, and it implies a nakedness before them, a vulnerability. I'm willing to give you everything I have. You feel I have wronged you. Rather than fight over it, I'm going to settle it quickly in a way that restores our relationship because I prioritize the relationship, not the coat. In this situation, we don't even know if the person is being sued has done anything wrong. You know, in America, we're entitled to our day in court. We deserve our day in court. We live in a litigious society. But most civil cases don't actually even go to trial either. They're normally more likely to go through an arduous arbitration process where the parties go back and forth, arguing for a prolonged period of time. The back and forth continues to build resentment and bitterness in their hearts, and the win-win solution could just as well end up lose-lose for everybody. The process consumes time, money, mental bandwidth, relationships, and sometimes you lose more than you thought was even possible. I don't think Jesus is saying it's sinful to have your day in court, but he does say in Matthew chapter 5, verse 24 and 25, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Rather than pursuing a matter that can escalate and consume your whole life, why not prioritize reconciliation? We all know people who have been wronged, and that's all they ever want to talk about to us. We may be that person, but are we focused on restoring the relationship? God put so much emphasis on this reconciliation in the body that he says to do so before we even give to him. What a gracious and loving God we serve. He longs for us to be unified and to love each other as he loves us. Now, the third scenario are official burdens. This is if someone forces you to do something who's in an official capacity. The verse says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This verse is applying that someone in authority forced you to do something. And according to the commentary from F.F. Bruce, there's a Persian loan word here called engareu. I don't know if I said that right, which references the ancient system whereby a person with an official title were entitled to call on regular people for unpaid service. It was looked on as slave service and degrading to the person who was obliged to fulfill the request. In modern application, let's say hypothetically that a minister of a church forced a bunch of members to come to his house and move his shed without compensation. It's degrading. Now, I'm obviously totally joking here, but Jesus challenges our heart towards obligations. Rather than just fulfill the obligation, take on the burden for someone else as well. By going 2 miles, you fulfill the obligation for someone else as an act of service, and they don't have to go the mile themselves. Jesus is calling us not to break out our scales or our rulers and measure what we do according to what was asked of us to do or what others are doing, but to go above and beyond that. The heart of a Christian should be to carry someone else's burden, not just their own. When we're dependable at work, as Christians should be, sometimes you get an extra project here and there. And most of the time, it doesn't come with any extra money. Do we see that as a compliment to our work ethic? Do we see it as a pathway to success? Beyond that, do we see it as a way of serving our coworkers? What's our heart when we get to ask to do something a little above and beyond? How about when it comes to roles and duties in the church? You know, I can struggle with thinking, didn't I just do communion? When's the last time that brother did communion? Instead of thinking, by me doing communion more often, the other brother can focus on something else. You know, when we get recruited for a board seat, there are very rarely any volunteers for that one. You know, I appreciate Ed's heart towards service and want to lift him up. His term on the board was up. He fulfilled 3 years of obligation. That's a long time to serve. And when no other candidates stepped forward, he volunteered to serve again for another 3 years. When meals are being organized, when rides are needed, post-COVID, not right now, when volunteers are needed, Jesus calls not just to figure out, okay, what do I owe, but rather fulfill our brother's obligations as well. Let someone else tell you, brother or sister, we actually have enough volunteers. You're good. That should be music to the saints' ears because so many people are meeting needs. Let's not forget who we're working for in all the obligations. Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 through 24 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Sometimes it's hard to remember that one, and I'm right there with you guys. Now, the last scenario is unreasonable claims, which all of these might have been unreasonable claims, but there's a whole nother level of unreasonable claim here. Verse 42 talks about things that seem like way too much to ask for. It says, give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You know, sometimes people ask for unreasonable things. This was true in Jesus' day, and it's still true now. I hate asking for things I believe to be unreasonable. I've signed a social contract that not everyone seems to be aware of. I never want to put people out. When we lived in another city, there was a brother who we would give frequent rides to. And after church, he would, on the spot, kind of say, hey, I need to run this errand. Can you take me there? And one of the things that he would quite frequently ask is, hey, can you pull through the drive-through for me? And so we would pull through the drive-through, and almost every time he would want to order things that are not on the menu. And that would make me feel so awkward and uncomfortable. I remember the one that was the most grievous to me. He ordered a 59-cent cheeseburger from McDonald's and wanted them to add lettuce and tomato to it for free. Blew my mind, and I felt so bashful to ask for this thing. I've never felt more serving than when I placed that order. You know, in the grand scheme of things, and the grand scheme of unreasonable requests, that's actually pretty tame, apart from my own thing here. There are always people in our lives who don't seem to have boundaries in asking us to do things or to give them things. Syracuse is one of the poorest large cities in the United States. There are needs all around us, and it's pretty common to see panhandlers and pretty easy to judge them as well. We also have a safety net system in our country that provides food and shelter for those in need. Not true of every country. And it doesn't always give us the warm and fuzzies knowing that we're paying taxes to fund that system. We can also sometimes feel justified in that judgment. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 through 10 says, warns against idleness and calls us to set an example of hard work. But there's also a ton of scriptures about giving generously to the poor. James chapter 1, verse 27 says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 17 says, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord. He will reward them for what they have done. Matthew chapter 25, verse 40 says, the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers or sisters of mine, you did for me. You know, we can, under the guise of Christianity, practice selfishness. Say, hey, we shouldn't give to that person because they haven't worked for it. But God says that when we give to the least of these, we actually give to him. We must remember who we're giving to. When we give to the least, we're actually giving to the Most High. And you know what? The act of giving actually softens our heart and reminds us how much others have given to us. Challenge yourself to budget a little money that you can give away. If you feel torn about giving to someone directly, there's a ton of local organizations that are doing great work to ameliorate homelessness and addiction. The Samaritan Center feeds people breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day, no questions asked. In My Father's Kitchen provides homeless people day labor and connects them to social services and a meal for the day. You know, it's great, and we should support Hope Worldwide and their Day of Giving, but there's also lots of needs locally that we can give to. And doing so, we're giving to the Lord, and we're softening our heart from the greed that we can have and wanting to build up our own American dream. So in conclusion, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, Jesus calls us to examine our heart when it comes to our pursuit of justice. An eye for an eye will just not do it. As Christians, we need to be careful about being consumed with ourselves and really work and strive to consider others. We must allow God to be our avenger and be more concerned with living a life of impact than getting revenge. We must be concerned with restoring friendships than restoring ourselves. We must look to outdo each other in giving we must be willing to give sacrificially. To God be the glory. You're dismissed.